So I'm going to use a hand mic because I want to make this a little more interactive. And I've got a few slides to share, which they're just kind of putting up. So just give us a minute. What I'm going to talk about while they put this up is the power of story. So all of you have heard of stories. Well, how many of you have children? Just raise your hands. So you all know, you all are actually already natural storytellers, right? And what I'm going to talk about is how this art of actually telling stories, which we used to do as children or we do with children, is one of the most important arts that we can use in business. And I'll talk a little bit about how that actually happens. So I think we already spoke in the morning of the Black Swan event, the change that's going on. And I think nothing captures it for me better than this quote, right? Which is, things are getting better and better, and worse, faster and faster. So we're living in a time of great change. And obviously in a time of great change, all organizations are struggling to keep up. They're trying to change as fast. But let's look at how easy or hard it is for organizations to actually change. So the first real study of change in organizations was done in 1995 by a person called Cotter. And what he studied organizations across industries, across countries, to try and see what percentage of organizations who attempt change actually succeed. So anyone can guess what that percentage is? Just shout out a number. What percentage of organizations who attempt to change actually succeed? 10%? Anyone else? 15? Okay. 25? Okay. Anyone else? It doesn't have to be in ascending order. You can say anything. 5%? Okay. So what he found was that that number was actually 30%. So 30% of organizations succeed. Now it's not that the rest don't achieve anything, but they don't really achieve what they set out to do. In the year 2000, another study was done. And there, what they found was that the success rate of organizations going through change is around 30%. In 2005, the Gartner Group did a study, and they found that the success rate of organizations going through change was, anyone can guess? So much? 30%. In 2010, McKinsey did a very large study to try and understand the success rate of organizations going through change and found that the answer was 30%. In 2015, just to make sure nothing has changed, we repeated the study and found that the number was still 30%. In 2020, of course, COVID hit, but if you had done the same study again, you would have found the same answer. Now the question to you is, if all these companies, great companies around the world, across sectors, countries, industries, with all the resources they put into trying to make change happen, and the answer is only 30%, what is it that comes in the way? Any guesses? What stops? What prevents the success rate from being harder? Resistance to change? Anything else? Mindsets? Sorry? Adaptability? Abstract ideas? Fear? So all of you are actually right in a different way. So when you actually look at what actually comes in the way, about 10% of it is because of inadequate resources. About 15% is because of all sorts of other reasons. But a full 40% is employees' resistance to change, which is fear, resistance to change, and management behavior not supportive of change, which is really quite surprising, which is because what that means is that despite all of what management says, they themselves are actually not supportive of change. And what you find is, therefore you can say that organizations don't really change. Is that fair to say? It's people that change, right? So the chairs, tables, books, computers don't change. So whenever people talk about organizational change, it's actually people who change. Now, where there's a problem with that, the problem is the following, which is that, you know, there was a physicist called Niels Bohr. Do you remember Niels Bohr? We must have learnt about him in school. Yeah, anyone remember Niels Bohr? Just wave your hand. Yeah, someone at the back is a fan of Niels Bohr. But no. So Niels Bohr had a quote, imagine how hard physics would be. Imagine how hard physics would be if particles could think. So the problem with organizational change is that the thousands of employees, and each of them will think through and go through their own process of making change happen. Which is why we have something above the surface, which are the behaviors in an organization, but below are the real mindsets that have to be changed. Now, there are many things that have to happen in order to change mindsets. One of the most important is what we call story, right? And this quote captures it well. Tell me the facts and I learn. Tell me the truth and I'll believe. But tell me a story and it will be in my heart forever. So I'm going to spend some time talking about what is story and how do you create a good story for the organization. So the purpose of a good story, and I'll talk about why a story is very different from a plan, is to engage the organization. And there must be 3 or 4 elements that are important. People must know why we are doing this. People must know what exactly they have to do, what they'll get in return. And that is what actually engages people. Why do stories actually work? There's a neuroscience and a science behind it. The reason why stories work is, so first of all, why a story false consensus, right? Which is a false consensus effect is essentially where if I believe something, I believe that everybody else believes the same. So there was this very interesting experiment done many years ago, I think it was at Stanford, where they asked people, or asked students to wear a sign around on their neck, big sign, saying "Eat at Joe's," and to walk around the campus. Now there was no restaurant called Joe's, so there was no such thing. So it was just a foolish thing. Just if someone comes up to you and says, "Can you wear this sign and walk across?" And they were told, if you don't wear it, nothing will happen. If you wear it, we'll teach you something. So there was no big reward. So some people wore it, some people didn't, as expected. Then they asked the people who wore the sign, what percentage of people do you think would agree to wear the sign? And they said about 65%. Then they asked the people who didn't wear the sign, what percentage of people do you think would wear the sign? And they said about 30%. Which means everyone believes that what they believe is what everyone else believes. And that's a big mistake in trying to make change happen. By the way, did you know that research shows that 65 to 70% of everything we speak, all of us in this room, is either gossip or stories? Do you know that? And you think about it, it's true, right? I know you're laughing, but it's gossip or story. So we actually live in stories, and therefore story becomes so important. And there's a neuroscience of story. When people hear a story, they actually get attracted to it. They actually kind of want to kind of follow it. Now imagine if Martin Luther King had said, instead of saying, "I have a dream," he had said, "Look, I have a plan with 10 initiatives." Do you think people would have been motivated by that? Of course not. So what's the real difference between a plan and a story is, a plan, which is also very important, is the most direct way to go from A to B. So all of you organizations will have a plan. You'll have a business plan, yes? I'm sure you do, right? So that's the most direct way. I need to achieve 7,000 crores revenues. This is the way I'm going to do it. The story is not the plan made in a bigger font, in a nice PowerPoint, presented in a different way. The story is the most interesting way to go from A to B. And that's actually what captures people. And this is a really important point to keep in mind. A plan is the most direct way to go from A to B, but a story is the most interesting way to go from A to B. To explain to people where you are going, you tell them your plan, but to inspire them to come along, you have to create a story. Is that clear? You have to create a story. So, okay, so give you an example. Here's an example. The cat sat on the mat. Is that an interesting story? Yes or no? Are you intrigued by that story? Not really. But if I change it to the cat sat on the dog's mat, so something has to happen. The story has to be interesting. It has to excite you. It has to kind of engage. It has to kind of engage you. That's what makes the story really, really powerful. And so therefore you can say, why is story important? Because it keeps you sharp. It inspires people. It makes it easier to change things. It touches people's hearts. That's all the reasons why stories are important. Now, there is one problem. in all your organizations, if I was to ask you, are there existing stories in the organization, what would you say? Yes? So there'll be stories about how bad the management is, you agree? Yes, there'll be stories about, how the industry is changing. So there'll always be existing stories. The problem is most of these stories are not very helpful. So the question is, your story has to actually replace some of the stories that are kind of in the organization. Because you're not telling stories into a vacuum. And in fact, what you find is that there are 3 types of stories in organizations that are unhelpful. And we call them the 3 Fs. The first are stories of fear. Jobs will be lost. I will get blamed. This won't work. My role will become less important. The other are stories of what we call fantasy, which is we'll achieve this even if we don't do anything different. Somehow or the other it will happen. I can do this on my own. We don't need a different plan. And then there's, of course, formula, which is this is the way it always works. You recognize these patterns. So maybe I'll ask you to do a little exercise, which is just with the person sitting next to you, spend just 2 minutes and just articulate what are 1 or 2 stories like this that are there in your organization. So just have a quick discussion with your neighbor. You introduce yourself to your neighbor, if you don't know them, and have a quick discussion. What are 1 or 2 stories in your organization that fall into some of these categories? So go ahead. Okay, let's hear from a few people. If you can just raise your hands and share some of your stories, I'd love to hear them. Anyone? Who'd like to share?
We are trying to recreate the vision, mission, values. So wherein there is a lot of hindrance for recreating the vision, mission, values. This is a 40 years organization, but so when we tried to recreate the vision as per the new management style and then thought process of the management, so there is a lot of resistance. Yeah. So then which we wanted to use this, the storytelling kind of thing, and then which is going to help us a lot in doing it.
Sure.
So that is what we try to do it.
Anyone else? What are some existing stories? Go ahead.
So I'm working with Indira Group of Institute as a Director IT. I have been trying to do the automation for the organization for the last 6-7 years. And the category of story which I wanted to speak is the fantasy. I'm in a fantasy that, I can do this automation without much of the effort. Yeah. And I'll do it on my way, and what I'm thinking is right, which is not happening.
Exactly.
There are a lot of adjustment, there are a lot of change which is, thrown to me. So that is the fantasy which I am facing right now.
Great example. Great example. Let's hear one more example. Anyone else? So fantasy, which is we don't need to do anything different. We can just do it this way. Go ahead.
Hi, Faridun. This is Kaustubh. I represent a training company, Theatre Resource, and the story that we face mostly is related with fear. So whether we get the payment, and if we get the payment, whether we get it on time.
Mm-hmm. So that's the fear story, which is we will not get the payment on time. Anyone else? One last person? Anyone else would like to share? Okay, so you can see all of us, the already existing stories. And the story you create has to deal with the stories that are already in the organization, right? Now let me talk about what makes a good story. And let me start by asking you a question. What is common across all of these? I've shown you a few things on the slides. What is common across all of these? Any guesses? They're all different types of stories. So what is common? Does anyone know what's common? Any guesses? They're all fantasy based, okay? Anything else? All transformation? So what if I told you that all of these are actually the same story? So all stories are fundamentally the same. So stories from time immemorial essentially follow a single story, which we call the monomyth, or the hero's journey. It's what is called the story of all stories. Okay? So any movie that you see, by the way, any movie that you see, any autobiography that you read will mostly follow this story. In fact, in Disney, they have a memo that actually lays this out, and all stories they create have to follow this. Now, what is that story? Let me explain to you what that story is. So the story is something called the hero's journey, which is a well-researched research point. And And just think about your life or anything and you'll resonate. The first part of the story is there's some call to adventure. So I'm going on with my life, or the actor is going on with his life in his daily way, and something suddenly happens that says, hey, listen, there's something bigger to do. It could be a shock, it could be that somebody is killed, it could be that there's an opportunity. The first next step of the story is a tendency to refuse the call. How many movies have you seen where the hero at some point says, I can't do it, right? I'm not going to do it. There'll be a scene where he will cry or she will cry and say, it's not possible for me to do it. And then magically, like Yoda in Star Wars, some sort of a guide or a senior person comes who gives that person encouragement. That no, you can. The mother will come out dying on her bed that, my son, you can absolutely go and do this. And then the hero or the hero actually passes a point of no return where they take a plunge into the unknown, which is what you call crossing the threshold. And then there are all sorts of battles that the person faces. But what you realize is that the biggest battle is actually the inner battle. It's not the battle outside. And then actually the hero returns and, and wins and comes back, right? So this is actually a beautiful structure, broadly speaking, for any story that you want to tell, because that's all our stories are essentially the same. So therefore, think about any story you create for your organization, it has to have a hero, it has to have why you're doing this, it has to have allies, it has to have an enemy, it has to have highs and lows, it has to have choices. Otherwise, it's not a story. It can't be, we want to become 7,000 crores by 2027. It will be an interesting journey. You know, it's like, how many of you know the story of Romeo and Juliet? You all know the story. So the story I can say in one line. Romeo fell in love with Juliet, they both died. Story over. That's not interesting, right? But Shakespeare takes us like through thousands of pages to come to that. So there has to be twists, turns, and so on and so forth. And as a structure, and of course there are many structures depending on context, but one that I find very useful is the following, which is you start with a backstory. So what are some of the things you've been proud of in your organization? What are some of the things that have gone? What's the history? Oh, you know, in 1987, we built the biggest bridge from here to here. We did this, blah, blah, blah. So you create a backstory. What's changed? What's the shock? But now there's something new happening. We need to do something different. What will success look like? What will that be? How can you make it as vivid as possible? Why is this so exciting? But then you come to a twist in the tail, right? It's not going to be easy. What's going to be tough about it? And then, of course, you can go up and down and make it kind of, make it more interesting and so on and so forth. So here are some of the basic structures of kind of creating story. Now, once you've created your story, and we don't have more time to talk more about it, there are different ways in which you can use the story. So one, of course, is to share the story. Obviously, if you've created one, you want to share it. But there are also other interesting ways like rituals and ceremonies or symbols that organizations use, right? So for example, and I won't go through all these examples, but Indra Nui at Pepsi, when they started talking about water conservation, used to tell the story of her childhood, where her mother would get up at 4 a.m. to go and actually fetch water. You want to give a personal touch to the story, right, which makes it really personal, so people really, really kind of like it. Or ceremonies. You've all heard of Jack Ma, right? Jack Ma of Alibaba. So Jack Ma, apparently, and I think it's true, but it is from what I've read, used to make his entire top team stand on their heads so they could see what the world looks like from a different perspective, right? Or Southwest Airlines, when they bought another airline, they had a merger, they actually did a mock marriage ceremony to bring the two together. So these are all very different, interesting ways. And the whole point is you want to break the pattern. You want to break the pattern of someone standing in front with a PowerPoint, like I'm doing right now, to doing something really interesting that engages people. And then, of course, there's symbols you can use. So I don't know how many of you know, but the Facebook headquarters is actually the old Sun Microsystems headquarters. They took over that building. And the old Sun Microsystems sign, they've turned it back and they've put their sign on it. So they never forget what happened to a company that didn't actually change very fast. So this is essentially, and I'll pause here, maybe we'll have a few minutes for any questions or other thoughts. But essentially, this is what I wanted to share, which is change is really hard. And at the core of it is the need to change mindsets. One of the most important ways you can change mindsets, not the only way, one of the most important ways is through the power of story. A story and a plan is not the same. The plan is the most direct way to go from one place to another. The story is the most interesting way. A story has to follow some elements. There are some elements that a story has to follow, typically in line with the hero's journey. There are already existing stories, so you need to replace those stories with other things. And finally, there are very many ways to engage it. And finally, even for yourself, there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. So all of us are natural storytellers. If we had more time, we would have done exercises. I would have proved to you how each and every one of you can be an extremely creative storyteller. So let me pause here. I don't know if we have time for any questions, but that's all I wanted to share. So thank you.